Now, the other subject I'd like to give a little special consideration to is fonts. I'd actually like to use the Helvetica font for all of my paragraphs that appear in my document. So let's go back and see how we would set that up. I'll find the paragraph rule here, and it's pretty easy to set the font style. Here I'm going to use the font-family property. I'll use a colon to set the value, and after that I can just specify the name of any font that I want used. So I could type in here Helvetica. I'll use a semicolon to end out my style, and let's save it and test it on our browser and see what it looks like. Now you can see all of my paragraphs change to show the Helvetica style. Of course, if you were working on a PC, you may have a problem. Or, let me be more specific, if you were working on any machine that doesn't happen to have the Helvetica font, you wouldn't have seen anything. The font would have stayed exactly the way it was. So this is the special consideration part. For all aspects of our HTML page, we need to be thinking about how this is going to look for the user. And certain things like fonts, we'd have to make sure that our user actually has those fonts before they'll be able to see them. Most web developers use a very common strategy to alleviate this, and that is supply more than one font. Basically, our font selection in the font family property specifies our first choice of fonts. If my user doesn't have that font, we can specify a second, third, and fourth, and so on choice. When the user's browser comes to the page, it'll look for the first font, and if it doesn't find it on the user's machine, it'll simply use the second one and work its way down the list. At the bottom, it'll always fall off and use whatever the default font is for the browser, which is usually Times. But for my page, I know that Arial is a very similar looking font, but it's installed on most PCs, whereas Helvetica isn't. So, if I want to specify that, I simply go after my first font name, use a comma, and specify another font, like Arial. You can specify whatever font order you'd like. If you specify a font that actually has spaces between the names, like for instance, Times New Roman, you just use a comma, like before, and add in quotes around the font name. Now there are a few fonts that are installed on most everybody's machine if they have a Mac or a PC. Generally, Helvetica, Arial, and maybe even Verdana are good for sans serif fonts, and Times New Roman or Times are good for serifed fonts. Now so far I've specified actual machine fonts or specific font faces to be used, but it's a really good idea when creating a font family like this to end off your selection with what we call a generic font. Now these are fonts that don't have a specific name, but they have a specific style, and most operating systems like Windows or Mac will find a font style to match whatever it is you've specified here. If I remove Times New Roman from my list here, you can see that I'm specifying so far all sans serif fonts. So for a generic font at the end, I'm simply going to specify sans-serif. And of course, if you go looking for a font on your system called sans serif, it's not there. But most Macs or PCs will map this back to either the Arial or the Helvetica font. This just makes sure that if the user runs out of fonts, we have one last effort where the operating system can go and find a sans serif font for us and make the page look the way you intended. I'm going to close off my font family with a semicolon. I'll save my changes. And if I go out and test the page, I won't see any difference right now because my browser is actually finding the Arial font at the first one. But now I've made sure my page is well defined for users on other operating systems with other fonts available. Now, working with fonts like this lets us explore one other very important concept about CSS, and that is the concept of inheritance. If you start looking through the reference listings for all the properties and look at the values associated with them, you'll see a specific value called inherit showing up a lot. Many of our properties can inherit their values from a parent. So let's see how that works inside of our document. Now, let's say I wanted to use the Helvetica, Arial, and sans serif font family not only for my paragraphs, but for my headings, and, quite honestly, what if I wanted to use it for all the other types of text in my document? Well, at first glance, you might think that we'd have to copy this rule and paste it into each one of our other selectors. I could add it to the H3 and the H2, but what if I had some lists later on? Well, an easy way to handle something like this is to use an enclosing or parent tag. If we take a look at our document, we've got a whole bunch of headings and paragraphs all enclosed inside of the main body tag. So rather than creating style settings for each one of the element types that I have inside my document, I could add a style type for the body tag. And if I don't have any conflicting styles on the elements inside of the tag, that property setting will be inherited by all the tags that are inside that one. Now, in the case of the body tag, that's every other tag that we have for our content. So that's a real easy way to be able to change the font setting. So let's try that out. I'll go back up to the top of my document, and the first thing I'll do is I'll create a body selector for a style. I'll go right at the top of my style tag and type in body. I'll need the curly brace open, and then I'll go down a couple lines and put the close in. And what I'll do next is I'll grab the font family property setting that we made in our paragraphs. I'll cut it out of that location, and I'll paste it into the body tag. Now, let me save my changes. Let's go and refresh our page. And you'll notice that the Arial font, which is the first one on my family list, is now used for all of my headings and the paragraphs as well.